Hi everyone, my name is Pierre-Olivier Méthot. I'm an associate professor in history and philosophy of science at Laval University, and I'm very pleased to take part in this year's virtual edition of the Kliofest. Actually, I was invited to give a lecture at the Croatian Academy of Arts and Science last month, but this talk was cancelled due to the pandemic. So I'm pleased to have a chance to introduce briefly two books that I have published last year about the Croatian-born French historian of science, Mirko Drazen-Gremek. The first of these is called Pathological Realities, Essays on Disease, Experiments and History. It is published at Fordham University Press in the Forms of a Living collection, and it also has a foreword by historian of science Hans-Jörg Reinberger. The book contains 9 essays by Mirko Gremek, many of which had never been translated into English before. One section of the book concerns what we call today emerging infectious diseases, and it is about what Gremek likes to refer to as changes in the pathocytosis. It also has a section on the history of biology, a section on the historiography of science and medicine, and the last section of the book concerns the political writings of Mirko Gremek. The second book is in French. It is titled Médecine, Science, Histoire, le legs de Mirko Gremek. So Medicine, Science, History, the Legacy of Mirko Gremek. It is published at Éditions Matériologiques, Paris. And this work is actually collects 6 essays from scholars in history and philosophy of science and medicine. And there is also an epilogue at the end by Jackie Duffin, who reflects in a more personal tone about the time that she was a PhD student with Gremek in the early 1980s. Jackie Duffin is now emeritus professor at Queen's University. So the book provides a detailed overview of Gremek's life and work, and it reflects more specifically on his contributions to the history of disease, the biology of aging, as well as on Gremek's relation to major philosophical figures such as Georges Canguilhem and Karl Popper. So when editing these books, I was especially interested in finding out who was Mirko Gremek, what took him from Zagreb to Paris, and how to locate his major contributions within the intellectual landscape of 20th century history of science and medicine. So who was Mirko Gremek? Well, he was a physician and a historian of science and medicine who was born in 1924. He first studied medicine in Zagreb between 1946 and 1951. However, he rapidly discovered that he was more interested in the history of medicine than in clinical practice as such. So after earning his medical degree, he moved on to doing a PhD in the history of science, which he got in 1958. And shortly after that, he created and took the directorship of the Institute of the History of Natural, Mathematical and Medical Sciences in Zagreb. But as Gremek wanted to explore new historical sources, and as he became more and more interested in the analysis of concepts, he left Croatia and moved to France in the early 60s. There, when he settled in Paris, and he worked under the guidance of Fernand Braudel, Alexandre Coiré, and Georges Canguilhem. With the latter, he completed a second PhD in 1971 on physiologist Claude Bernard. Gremek's doctoral project drew on his detailed commentary of the unpublished papers of Bernard that were kept at the Collège de France and that he was invited to edit and to catalogue. Following this, Gremek was professor at the École pratique des hautes études for almost 2 decades, and he made fundamental contributions to the history of science and medicine. In addition to his book on Bernard, he published 2 important books during the 1980s. The first one is called Diseases in the Ancient Greek World and was published in 1983. And the second one is A History of AIDS, Emergence and Origins of a Modern Pandemic, published in 1989 and translated the year after. Gremek was fluent in 8 European languages, and he became an influential figure in the history of science and medicine during the second half of the 20th century. He truly had an exceptional capacity for work. His bibliography, for instance, includes more than 1,000 items, and his writings range from ancient medicine to modern physiology to contemporary pandemics and epidemics. He considered the history of science to be a kind of laboratory of epistemology, and he made use of scientific knowledge to shed light on the nature of the pathological reality in the past. And conversely, he used the historical methods to try to understand the emergence of new diseases. In contrast to traditional history of medicine, which focuses on the singular or particular trajectory of individual diseases, Germek put forward a global historical vision in which diseases are historical agents that interact with each other and impact the course of human culture. Germek thought that no disease should be studied in isolation, but always and only as part of a larger community of illnesses that are in a state of equilibrium. But this ecological equilibrium is dynamic and can be ruptured, leading to the emergence of new threats. So whenever a disease disappears, another one makes its appearance. After writing the first history of AIDS, Germek introduced a framework to clarify the multiple ways in which a disease is emerging. Overall, he argued that the so-called new diseases are usually not the result of newly evolved virulent organisms, but of microbial germs that gain entry into susceptible host populations, often thanks to human activities. If one looks at the current COVID-19 pandemic, one can try using Germek's work to understand what changes in the global pathocytotic equilibrium led to this pandemic, and to determine what scientists mean when they claim that it is a new disease. Is it a new disease because it did not exist in particular regions before it was introduced in some other parts of the world? Or is it new because it never existed in human populations and only in animal populations? Or is it completely new in the sense that the SARS-CoV-2 virus did not exist prior to the first clinical manifestation of the disease sometime around last December? As you can see, Germek's work is historically wide-ranging and philosophically insightful, and it deserves to be considered closely by historians and philosophers of science. Both pathological realities and médecine science histoire provide a window into his scientific legacy that needs to be explored further. As Antje Greinberger wrote in his foreword, Germek was a paragon of crossing boundaries, national, cultural, linguistic, as well as disciplinary boundaries. Well, I think we should try to follow his example. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the virtual Kliofest. Thank you.